It's December 23rd, 2025, and President Trump is expected to meet on Monday, December 29th, with Bibi Netanyahu. I believe this is going to be the Prime Minister of Israel's fifth visit to the U.S. this year, which is unprecedented, but I'm sure that we can understand why that's the case. But according to NBC News, he's expected to request that Trump support another U.S. military-led military operation against Iran, this time targeting Iran's ballistic missiles project and infrastructure. So, as you remember, military strikes were carried out this year in June on the 21st and 22nd under the code name Operation Midnight Hammer. Airstrikes by the U.S. military. And these airstrikes were preceded by 5 months of fake negotiations between Trump's team and Iran. I call them fake because they never intended to make a deal on Iran's nuclear program to begin with. That was all a charade, and it's my opinion that Trump was planning on doing strikes on their nuclear facilities all along, and that he was just kind of stringing along the Iranian government so that he could make the case or make it appear that he was always being reasonable. Iran was being intransigent because they weren't following Trump's and his team's wishes and Israel's wishes. And so I believe the negotiations were certainly just political theater. And so the negotiations happened. They weren't successful. Strikes by the U.S. were carried out in the ending part of June this year. The targets were Fordow, and that's one of Iran's enrichment facilities of uranium, Natanz, a nuclear facility, and Isfahan, a nuclear tech center. So initially, Israel had unilaterally started to strike Iran or attack Iran. And those attacks started on June 13, 2025, and led up to our involvement in the war in the ending part of June, the 21st and 22nd. And so allegedly, those airstrikes set back Iran's nuclear program by 1 to 2 years, which we really can't verify. I think even up till now, we haven't confirmed the extent of the damage or whether or not anything was moved out of the facilities that the U.S. had bombed. So we'll dig into the article here. This is from antiwar.com. The article says, quote, the report is that Netanyahu will stress Israel's concern over Iran's production of ballistic missiles and will present Trump with options for the U.S. to join or assist Israel with an attack on Iran. Israeli officials are also warning that Iran is reconstituting its nuclear sites that were bombed by the U.S. during the war in June, but that was not their immediate concern. So they've subtly moved the goalposts. I don't think that Israel's ever, approvingly looked at Iran's ballistic missile program. I think they've always wanted to get rid of that program, but the initial focus was on the nuclear facilities and their alleged nuclear weapons program. And so that's supposedly been taken care of during the bombing campaign earlier this year, led by the U.S. And now the focus has switched to the ballistics program. So the article goes on, according to a report from Israel Heyman, Israeli officials are preparing an intelligence dossier on Iran to present to Trump. Netanyahu's office has said the meeting will take place at Mar-a-Lago on December 29th, though President Trump suggested last week that it wasn't finalized, saying we haven't set it up formally, but he'd like to see me. That would be, he's fine with meeting him. I think that, I'm just going to guess, but I would say that the Israelis probably made this choice for him, said we're coming, and, I don't think that Trump is going to push them back, so. And as an aside, I'm sure this dossier is input from our own intelligence services. And I don't think it's given, though, that Trump is going to follow through with any of this, especially during midterms, right? So the article continues, Treaty Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, has been warning that another war with Iran was likely since Israel didn't achieve all of its goals during its previous attack on the country, pointing to the fact that Iran's missile strikes forced Israel to agree to a ceasefire quickly. Now, of course, their goal is regime change overall in Iran, but I don't really see a scenario wherein the U.S. goes any further than potentially more missile strikes, right? That just seems pretty realistic given that it's an election year, both in Israel next year and the U.S. So we will probably see, that my guess would be missile strikes at the minimum. But the idea of regime change and basically reorienting the Middle East in Israel's direction, where Israel has expanded and is the regional hegemon in the region, I just don't see that happening right now. The talks of more strikes, as I said, would be more beneficial just for election's sake, election purposes, on the part of Israel, not necessarily on the U.S. part. Now, more questions and concerns arose over the previous strikes within the conservative movement, within the MAGA movement, than I think Trump and his administration was willing to tolerate. That opened up a lot of questions about, the risks of, something spiraling militarily out of control with Iran. So there were a lot of concerns on the right wing, specifically the MAGA movement, when Trump hit Iran the last time. And they didn't do well at selling it to the American people. But enough of them were persuaded that it was the rational thing to do because of the negotiations and how they led nowhere, which is what I said at the beginning. The negotiations, in my estimation, were carried out by the administration just to give the impression that they were being fair and giving Iran a chance to basically give up in totality any kind of nuclear program that they have. So, plus, given the elaborate negotiation process that Trump engaged in with Iran earlier this year, he'll probably want to create another casus belli like that before striking Iran again. So again, you'd have to rebuild this apparatus and try to give the American people and his base the impression that he's genuinely wanting to work with Iran and negotiate with them. And when they're intransigent or they don't agree with the direction the negotiations are going in, Trump will probably take the opportunity to do strikes. But again, is he going to go through all of these? Is he going to go through all of that again just to convince us that it's okay, just to convince the American people that we have a case for bombing Iran's ballistic missile program? I doubt it. But there's a chance he might. But the article picks back up, the June war resulted in mutual deterrence, a situation Iran cannot accept, but one that is intolerable for Netanyahu and his legacy. Ultimately, the conflict was neither a victory for Israel nor for Iran. And this is from, again, Parsi, from Responsible Statecraft. It is precisely this balance of terror, Parsi goes on, that prompts Israel to seek a new round. Israel's military doctrine does not allow for any of its regional foes to deter it or challenge its military dominance. Iran's missile program currently does exactly that, Parsi added. And this is precisely why Trump must say no to Netanyahu, because Israel's objective is not security in the conventional sense. It's not self-defense like so many of the Zionists and Israel First crowd likes to assert. It's not about self-defense. It's about their larger strategic posture in the Middle East relative to their neighbors. And they want absolute dominance. They want to be the regional hegemon. And with that comes not only the weakening of all your neighbors, but also many economic benefits, right? Economic benefits that probably would be beneficial to the US first, but that's a different story. And so we're going to turn for a moment to Gaza. And recently, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, his special envoy to the Middle East, and the administration pitched the Project Sunrise proposal plan at a cost of $112.1 billion over 10 years, and they proposed this plan to foreign investors. And of course, this Project Sunrise is the proposal to turn Gaza into a futuristic coastal destination, or the Trump Riviera that we've been talking about. Now, I haven't talked about it much. I've referenced it a couple times in recent videos, but Trump has kind of been on and off of this. You know, he in the beginning in this year, whenever this idea was brought up in February during Netanyahu's first visit to Washington, he's talking about expelling the population from Gaza, rebuilding it in his image, demolishing it, rebuilding it, etc. He's been bearish on this topic for a while. He's talked out both sides of his mouth, as he typically does when he makes these grand proposals, like ending the war with Ukraine in 24 hours. But it seems like something is solidifying here, right? And so Project Sunrise, we'll get into some of this. It is as follows. This is, I believe, from Reuters. A team led by President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff developed a draft proposal to convert the bombed-out enclave into a gleaming metropolis. In 32 pages of PowerPoint slides, replete with images of coastal high-rises alongside charts and cost tables, the plan outlines steps to take Gaza residents from tents to penthouses and from poverty to prosperity. I hope that none of that language is in those PowerPoints, because that's just absolute bullshit. That would never happen. None of those people, none of the Palestinian people would be getting penthouses or any of those things, right? They wouldn't have anything to do with many of these areas that Trump is looking at modernizing with, modern technology and such. And as an aside, remember, it was this year in February, like we just talked about, that Trump proposed this Riviera of the Middle East with Netanyahu. And he's, again, been back and forth on some of the main points that he brought up. And I think this is just, at first, you can think of the proposal back in February as maybe a beta test, just to see how his base and how the country would react to us having direct control over the Gaza Strip. And this is probably, again, why he's been bearish on the topic. But it seems that quietly, like I just said, this stuff is slowly coming together for the parties that are interested. So the article continues, it does not specify where precisely the 2 million displaced Palestinians would live during reconstruction. The U.S. has shown the slides to prospective donor countries, including the Gulf kingdoms, Turkey, and Egypt. Some U.S. officials who have reviewed the plan have serious doubts about how realistic it is. They are skeptical that Hamas will agree to disarm in the first place for the plan to take effect, which, as we covered in our last video on Israel and Gaza, they are refusing to give up their arms right now, which is, again, a breach of the ceasefire. We gave the reasons why they aren't going to be giving up their firearms. And so the idea that any of this can take place before hostilities continue, because they will, inevitably, it's a pipe dream. Now, will they continue, like we went over before, on the same level as they once were a couple months ago before the ceasefire? Probably not. But it's going to still be a hot conflict. So they are skeptical that Hamas will agree to disarm in the first place, and even then the U.S. could convince rich nations to foot the bill for transforming a dangerous post-war environment into a high-tech cityscape. They can make all the slides they want, said Stephen Cook, a senior fellow at the Mideast, for the Mideast at the Council on Foreign Relations. No one in Israel thinks they will move beyond the current situation, and everyone is okay with that. Nothing happens until Hamas disarms. Hamas will not disarm, so nothing will happen, he said, which is a great way to sum it up. Kushner, Witkoff, senior White House aide Josh Gruenbaum, and other U.S. officials pulled the proposal together. Officials said they received input from Israeli officials, people in the private sector, and contractors. And the security conditions follow. If the security conditions allow, Trump officials said they could put the plan into action in as soon as 2 months. Truly ambitious, isn't he? You know, when it comes to Trump and how he manages foreign policy, how he manages the peace that he allegedly brokers between certain countries, it's always done in a breakneck speed and details are thrown out the window. That's not to say that some of his advisors aren't detail oriented and they aren't, skeptically looking at some of these proposals that he's coming up with. But what I am saying is that this is something that if this is true that they just want 2 months, they're thinking that within 2 months this kind of thing can get started. They've got another thing coming, And if that is the expectation, then it's all the more clear that Israel will have to make a move on Hamas. If Trump is wanting to, not even if it isn't 2 months, but if he's looking at a timetable this year of getting this project started to any extent, then it's going to call for Israel to reinitiate hostilities against Hamas. So, the article continues, a 20-plus year roadmap shows the effort starting with the removal of destroyed buildings, unexploded ordnance, and Hamas's tunnel, while residents are provided with temporary shelter, field hospitals, and mobile clinics. Temporary shelter will likely be outside of the Gaza Strip, just to be clear there, without any prospect of return. We covered that in another video. They're already starting to remove Palestinians from the Gaza Strip quietly through private third-party organizations connected to the Israeli Defense Ministry. Once cleared, the construction of permanent housing, medical facilities, schools, and religious spaces will begin. Roads get paved, power lines connected, crops planted. Sounds like paradise, doesn't it? But can you see this happening within the 3 years Trump has left in office? Only after that would the longer-term goals of lavish beachfront properties and modern transportation hubs be realized. And, something else as an aside is that we have to remember that not only do they have to disarm Hamas, but there are also independent militias Israel has been funding operating in the Gaza Strip right now. So how is this going to happen? Even if Hamas lays down all their arms, as we've said hundreds of times on this show, there's no way to verify that. And so you're going to have all of these companies and contractors trying to rebuild, and there's always going to be this prospect that there might be some kind of terrorist attack. So one slide titled New Rafah sees it serving as Gaza's seat of governance, which is on the southern part of the Gaza Strip and home to more than 500,000 residents. They would live in a city with more than 100,000 housing units. This is just more of just describing what they're proposing. So costs are projected to taper off as Gaza makes money heading into the plan's second decade. The proposal calls for monetizing 70% of Gaza's coastline beginning in year 10 and estimates that the glitzy Riviera could lead to more than $555 billion in long-run investment returns. Now, with that kind of money being poured into the coastline of the Gaza Strip, do you really believe in the end that any of the Palestinians that are living there right now, should they be allowed to come back after the reconstruction is complete, you think they're going to have access to any of these resorts, working there, being employed, any of these things? Unlikely, right? they'll very likely build their ghettos for the Palestinians far away from the coastline businesses. So also, just on a last note, this plan would likely also be financed by future returns. It could be, just throwing it out there on the future returns, if this Gaza Canal project, a proposal going back to the 1960s, is ever realized. It's also known as the Ben Gurion Canal Project, which is a proposed 160 to 293 kilometer waterway that cuts through the Gaza Strip. And it's intended to connect the Gulf of Aqaba, or the Red Sea, directly to the Mediterranean through the Negev Desert. And this would be basically an alternative to the Suez Canal that cuts through Egypt. Now, in 22 and 23, consider this, that revenues from transit fees through the Suez totaled between $8 and $10 billion. Not to mention the massive investment in service and industries tied to the Suez Canal. Now, financing, again, this would be something that would be truly beneficial to Israel, especially if they do capture or completely take over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, expanding as they want to do and turning into Greater Israel. And with these kinds of economic incentives and investment, they could genuinely become the regional hegemon in the Middle East, which is what they want. Also, another prospective project, the financing from potentially opening financing for the Gaza Riviera plan could potentially come from the Gaza Marine Field, located 30 kilometers off the Gaza coast. And that's estimated to contain 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, historically, Israel has restricted development of this gas field due to security issues, of course, like Hamas. Now that allegedly Hamas is eradicated and they're working on this, eradicating the rest of them, the odds of them pursuing this project are not that bad. Now, consider these revenues and how they'd move forward Trump and Netanyahu's twisted dream and the geopolitical benefits and potential for Israel, like we just talked about. Should these two initiatives gain enough momentum, the benefits go to Trump, his family, the multinational corporations, the EU, and many more. The EU, as we can see here, the EU has been a big purchaser of Russian oil. The U.S. is trying to wean the EU off of Russian oil. And so that could be an alternative resource, an additional resource, because the EU already has alternative resources to Russian gas. If I said oil, then my mistake. But this would be another way to backstop it, the loss from the Russian gas. Now, of course, again, all this can happen only if Hamas is completely eradicated, and that would just mean, in the words of Israeli officials, all of the Palestinians would have to leave the Gaza Strip. That would be the one thing that would eradicate the security risk and create the conditions that would be conducive for developing these projects. And so if you need any more evidence of what the Israelis are really thinking about, and by extension, many within our government, we have this quote here, and this is how we'll go ahead and end at this point. But the Israel Defense Minister, Israel Katz, vowed on Tuesday to never leave all of the Gaza Strip, saying the IDF will establish military settlements in the enclave's northern part. Only later he walked it back. So I guess we're really just supposed to believe it, since he just walked it back. But this just kind of gives you an idea of where the mindset is of people within Israel's government, their defense ministry, people within the U.S. who prop up and support Israel's government and their initiatives in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. They were never intending on leaving, right? They're digging in to the little bit of into that area, the yellow or the green line that's cutting Gaza off from, that's cutting Gaza in two right now. So their intention is never to leave. And he's basically just saying the quiet part out loud. I don't buy any of that, well, he walked it back stuff. So this is where things are presently in terms of Iran and the Gaza situation. Scary stuff, but we'll see if any of this comes to fruition. And we'll be back later this week or next week with another update on the situation in the Middle East. We'll see you next time.